The American Civil War was a conflict that ultimately arose due to the South's desire to expand slavery out west. However, the new president of the United States in 1860, who was just elected, Abraham Lincoln, did not want the expansion of slavery out west and supported a prohibition of slavery in Western territories. Despite Lincoln actually being against the idea of abolishing slavery totally in the areas where it already existed, Southerners did not believe in just preserving slavery but also expanding it. So, thus, ultimately, 11 Southern states left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Ultimately, though, the Confederacy lost the Civil War and was forced to rejoin the Union, and the institution of slavery was abolished. So that brought me to thinking, what if the North actually seceded from the South during the Civil War? A common misconception about the Civil War that has often been brought by many lost cause adherents or people who believe that the Confederacy was fighting for states' rights or something noble instead of just slavery, believe that the North represented federal overreach and federal power, while the South represented states' rights. In fact, this could be nothing further from the truth. The northern states were also concerned with states' rights, particularly their own states' rights to prevent slavery and allow fugitive slaves into their states. The South, on the other hand, wanted to restrict the rights of these northern states when it came towards harboring fugitive slaves and wanted to be able to meddle in the other states' business, especially in the North, by being able to force them to return fugitive slaves. In fact, many Northerners cried out against the overreach of states' rights, which was proposed by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was part of the Compromise of 1850. Ultimately, though, the South seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery and their own ability to expand the institution westward. It was not over states' rights or anything like that. So, with the North actually having a view of states' rights themselves, it would actually make sense for an alternate scenario where the North would secede from the country because they viewed that their states' rights to not have slaves would be infringed upon by the rest of the nation, just like how the South, in our own timeline, viewed that their states' rights to have slaves would, in fact, be infringed upon. So, let's look at this scenario. For starters, the North and especially several New England states had actually flirted with the idea of leaving the Union in the year 1812 over the War of 1812 in the infamous Hartford Convention. In the Hartford Convention, several New England states wanted to leave the Union because they had really close ties with the British, and the War of 1812, which was with the British, was hurting them economically. So they believed it was in their best economic interests to leave the Union, just like how the South, in our own timeline in 1860, also wanted to leave the Union over their own economic interests due to slavery. However, many of these New England states ultimately did not succeed, and the Hartford Convention was ultimately exposed, and the Federalist Party thus died as a major political party. However, still, the Hartford Convention did actually give some insight to Southerners, especially John C. Calhoun, who later used the Hartford Convention and was influenced by it in his own rationale. He believed that if New England could secede over the War of 1812, then the South would also be justified to secede over the issue of tariffs and later on slavery during the nullification crisis in the 1830s. So, with that being established, it is very possible that the North would actually leave the Union over the issue of slavery, especially if they believed that the expansion of slavery westward was going too far, or if the South was infringing on their rights to be free states. Something interesting to actually note, though, is that in the election of 1800, the South and North population balance was roughly equal, with the South possessing 65 electoral votes and the North possessing 73 electoral votes. However, this drastically changed by the time of the 1860 election, where the amount of Northern electors vastly outpopulated the number of Southern electors. Key to the South's ultimate decision to leave the Union was their feeling of being outpopulated by the North, both in terms of raw total of states, which would give the North a key advantage in the Senate, as well as raw population, which would allow the North to control the House of Representatives. A key reason why the North had a huge population control over the South in 1860 that they did not have in 1800 is because of one thing: immigration. There was a huge amount of immigration to the United States, and this immigration came particularly to the North and not as much to the South between the time period of 1800 and 1860. Most of these immigrants came from Ireland as well as Germany. However, why did these immigrants come to the North and not to the South? This is because of the Industrial Revolution that was going on in the North. Ultimately, though, this Industrial Revolution is what led to a massive amount of Irish immigrants coming from their own home country of Ireland to many urban centers in the United States, such as New York, as well as New Jersey, as well as much of New England, which included Boston and Massachusetts. Incidentally, these Irish Americans were also very proud Democrats and voted Democratic, which ultimately made the North much more balanced when it came towards political structure than the South, which was mostly just a one-party system after the Whig Party had collapsed. However, one key man from England is what ultimately brought the Industrial Revolution to America. Had this man not immigrated from England to the United States, the Industrial Revolution likely would never have even occurred in the first place in the United States. In fact, immigration from England to the United States, especially from people who worked in textile mills and were instrumental in England's Industrial Revolution, those kind of people were not allowed to leave England. However, he ultimately broke the law and still left to United States and still left England to go to the United States and ultimately brought the Industrial Revolution with him. His decision to ultimately break the law is what led to the United States adopting the Industrial Revolution, and had he never left, it is very possible that the United States would never even go through the Industrial Revolution that he brought with him. This man's name was Samuel Slater. Slater was called the father of the Industrial Revolution by many Americans, including Andrew Jackson. However, in England, he was called Slater the Traitor because he ultimately broke the country's laws by coming to Rhode Island. So, had Slater actually followed England's laws, it is very possible that he would never come to America, and thus the Industrial Revolution, which he himself brought to America by introducing new methods towards textile production, as well as methods to make the process of industrialization much more simple. Slater's whole thing that he brought from England to America would never have even occurred in the first place had he actually abided by England's laws. So without the Industrial Revolution, the North would remain largely agricultural. This would include both parts such as New England as well as the Midwest. However, agriculture in the North was very difficult, especially in New England, where the freezing temperatures as well as rugged terrain and mountainous nature of the area would make farming very difficult, and that's why industrialization was primarily occurred there instead of in the South, because the geography of New England was very poor for agriculture. Thus, industrialization was a better method of ultimately producing things. So without a huge surge of immigrants coming from their home countries to the United States due to the industrialization that was going on to the United States and the opportunities there, most immigrants would actually come to the United States to become farmers instead of workers in the textile industry or other industries. In fact, a prime area where immigrants would now come to without the Industrial Revolution would actually be the South. When it comes towards farming, the South easily outpaces both New England as well as the Midwest. The South's weather, which was very humid as well as rainy, as well as its general flat topography, would be significantly better for agriculture than New England, which was very rugged and mountainous, as well as very snowy. The South would be very good for the production of many agricultural commodities, such as cotton as well as tobacco in parts of the Upper South. Many of these workers would be hired by plantation owners, although they would also have to compete with slaves for labor. And ultimately, due to a desire to not compete with slaves, many of these immigrants who would come to the South from areas such as Ireland and Germany would actually desire to see slavery abolished or at least significantly reduced in Western areas so that they wouldn't have as much competition for labor, not really because of any moral qualms or considerations. So, with a larger population of immigrants coming to the South because of its better terrain for agriculture and farming than the North, we would see the South actually have a significantly higher population than the North in this alternate scenario, rather than vice versa. In fact, the House of Representatives would have more members from the South than the North. In our own scenario, there were more Northern representatives than Southern representatives, and this ultimately led to an intricate power balance where the South often controlled the Senate because of their number of states, as well as Southern sympathizers from Northern states, while the House of Representatives was controlled by the North because the North simply outpopulated the South. The Missouri Compromise would be very different in this alternate scenario. In our own scenario, the Senate voted to make Missouri a slave state, while the House voted to make Missouri a free state. With the House actually being controlled by Southerners in this scenario, it is likely that both chambers would simply vote to make Missouri a slave state, and then President James Monroe would sign the bill that would make Missouri a slave state. However, there would be no need to placate the North by adding Maine as a state and splitting it from Massachusetts, there would also be no need to create a 3630 parallel, also known as the Missouri Compromise line. Instead, it would simply be if a state wanted slavery or if it wanted to be free, it would then submit its application bill to Congress, and Congress would then consider it and approve it. This would be very difficult for free states to then become states because of the fact that both chambers of Congress would be controlled by Southerners. In 1850, when the Mexican-American War would ultimately end and the Congress would have to decide what to do with the new Mexican territories, it would become more difficult than it would be in our own timeline because of the fact that Southern slave owners would control both the House and the Senate. However, it wouldn't be as easy for them as the Missouri bill would be because of the fact that President Zachary Taylor would likely veto any bill that would make California a slave state. This is due to the fact that Taylor himself opposed expanding slavery in these western lands because he viewed it as infeasible because many of these western lands were dry, arid, and slavery was not even economically or geographically feasible in that area. Many Southerners were angered by Taylor's decision, and they would be in this alternate scenario because many of them had actually believed that Taylor was one of them because he himself was a Louisiana slave owner. However, after Taylor's death and Millard Fillmore's ascension to the presidency, the Compromise of 1850 ultimately happened in our own timeline. However, Fillmore would also oppose efforts to make California a slave state because he himself was a Northerner and also generally opposed just blanket expansion of slavery out west. And there would be some Democrats also who would oppose the expansion of slavery in California because many Californian citizens actually did not want slavery, and these Northern Democrats supported popular sovereignty over Congress just simply expanding slavery, even when the residents of the state don't want it. So the ultimate compromise that would be reached would be that Northern California would be split off from Southern California. Northern California would become a free state, while Southern California would become a slave state. In fact, many residents of Southern California in our own scenario wanted California to become a slave state. However, they were outpopulated by Northern Californians. But in this alternate scenario, the state would be split between NorCal as well as SoCal. So, next up, we would have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. This law would still be proposed by Stephen Douglas, and it would still likely pass Congress because both chambers would be controlled by slave owners, as well as the fact that Franklin Pierce would sign this bill into law. In fact, Franklin Pierce would have a much easier time getting reelected in this scenario because unlike in our own scenario where he had a hard time facing renomination even in his own party, because of the fact that there were more Northerners than Southerners in the Democratic Convention, because the number of convention seats to each state was based off of the number of electoral votes that each state got. However, with the South actually having more electoral votes in this scenario than the North, there would be more Southern conventions than Northern. There would be more Southern delegates than Northern delegates in both the Whig as well as Democratic Party nominations. This would allow Pierce to be renominated without much of a fight. So with Franklin Pierce being renominated in his second term, he would also likely approve a law that would make Kansas a slave state. In fact, this was a huge area of contention between the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party in our own scenario. The Southern Democrats believed in this vote held by Kansas to approve the so-called Lecompton Constitution, which would make Kansas a slave state. However, the vote counting in this election was very fraudulent, and the residents of Kansas actually wanted to make their state free. However, this would still ultimately not pan out, and many Southerners brought bills to Congress that would make Kansas a slave state. Buchanan, in our own scenario, President James Buchanan supported making Kansas a slave state as a way to simply end the controversy. However, other Democrats, such as Stephen Douglas of Illinois, were against the Lecompton Constitution because they knew that it was fraudulent and that Kansas itself wanted to become a free state. However, in this alternate scenario, with Southerners controlling both the House of Representatives as well as the Senate due to their population boost, it would be very clear that the Lecompton Constitution would pass both chambers of Congress. And Franklin Pierce, in our own scenario, although he was sitting on the sidelines because he was defeated in his renomination bid, he also supported the Lecompton Constitution and would likely sign it into law, and thus making Kansas a slave state. With Kansas as a slave state, there would also be other states that would become slave states as well. Utah, for example, in 1852, passed a bill in its own state that would make it a slave state. However, Congress ultimately did not want to make Utah a state because of the fact that there was a very high Mormon population there, and many Mormons practiced polygamy, which they viewed as un-American, as well as the fact that many Northerners in the House of Representatives, who held the majority, did not want to add another slave state to the Union. However, with Southerners in control of both chambers of Congress and Utah now submitting an application to become a slave state, they would likely approve of Utah despite their own concerns over polygamy, because they themselves would prioritize their own interests as slave states rather than over moral considerations regarding the Mormons' practice of polygamy. So with that being said, Utah would ultimately become a state under the Pierce administration. Not just Utah, but also New Mexico, which also submitted an application for statehood in 1859 to become a slave state, but again, due to a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, as well as racist fears because of the fact that New Mexico had a questionably low white population, New Mexico did not become a state. However, in this scenario, again, with Southerners controlling both chambers of Congress, as well as a president who would be sympathetic to their interests, they would ultimately make New Mexico a slave state as well, and would prioritize the expansion of slavery, likely over racist notions of Native Americans as well as Mexicans living in the area. Plus, many enslaved people in New Mexico were also Native American, and it is likely that white Southerners who would move to New Mexico would rather also just enslave Native Americans and Mexicans living in the area. With that being said, though, the Democratic Party would have a major rift, with some Democrats such as Stephen Douglas wanting to leave the party because they believe that the party has abandoned its principles of popular sovereignty and is instead simply moving to appease the slave owners. So, with this being said, the Republican Party would also form over outrage over this idea of slavery spreading out west, and many Republicans would actually float the idea of secession from the Union regarding northern states because of the fact that slavery was expanding at a rate that they did not want to, and due to fears of being outpopulated in both the Senate and House, which is, in our own scenario, what ultimately led to the South seceding themselves. So, the Democratic Party nomination in 1860 would be a fight between John C. Breckinridge, Franklin Pierce's vice president, as well as Stephen Douglas. Ultimately, though, Breckinridge would be the winner of this nomination due to the fact that there would be more Southern than Northern delegates. Also, the convention was being held in Charleston. So, after that is out of the way, the Northern Democrats would then form their own convention and nominate Stephen Douglas as their candidate out of outrage and belief that the Democratic Party has violated its own principles of popular sovereignty. Next up, the Republican Party would nominate William Seward as their nominee. The main reason why they didn't nominate Seward over Lincoln in our own scenario is because they didn't want to anger the South, because Seward was viewed as too radical. However, in this scenario, the North would be what would be considered radical, and Republicans would have no interest in placating the South, and some of them would even consider leaving the Union themselves. So Seward would be the Republican nominee. And as for the remaining Whigs, who would be upset with the party becoming more radical, as well as the new Republican Party forming, the remaining Whigs would nominate John Bell, a Southerner, as their nominee, as an effort to ultimately try to prioritize national unity. And this would basically be the same as a constitutional union, nominating Bell in our own scenario. Ultimately, this would be the election map in the 1860 presidential election. William Seward would win 92 electoral votes, John Bell would win 12, Breckinridge would win 157, and Douglas would win 32. Breckinridge would ultimately secure the presidency. As you can see in the map, the southern amount of representatives is larger because there would be more immigrants coming to the south instead of the north in this alternate scenario, and many of these Irish immigrants that went to the north through the ports of New York City to become industrial workers would instead enter the South through the ports of Charleston as well as New Orleans and the Chesapeake Bay in order to become workers on the fields and agricultural workers. One area of the nation that doesn't have a significantly reduced population or significantly increased population in this alternate scenario is the Midwest, where most of the immigrants there were actually German instead of Irish, and they didn't desire to become industrial workers but rather farmers. And this desire would continue in this scenario, and considering how they already chose the South over the Midwest in this scenario, they would likely do so again. So with a mostly static population in the Midwest but a drastically reduced population in the North and drastically increased population in the South, we would see this as ultimately being the balance of population. So, the first state to secede from the Union over John C. Breckinridge's election as president would be the state of Massachusetts. Then the entire region of New England would follow. Soon enough, the upper Midwest would also leave the Union. Eventually, the states of New York and New Jersey would leave the Union. In our own scenario, New Jersey and New York were very mixed politically because they had a large population of Irish immigrants that supported Democrats and were less enthusiastic about the Civil War as well as slavery. On the other hand, though, the residents of New York and New Jersey that were Native Americans, meaning that they were born in America and they had a huge line of descent of American ancestors, were very opposed to slavery and supported the Republican Party. So in this scenario, Republicans would have huge advantages in both New York as well as New Jersey and would likely secede from the Union early on. The final state to secede from the Union and join the new free states of America would be the state of Pennsylvania. Ultimately, there would be 5 border states in this alternate scenario, which would be northern states or free states that remained in the Union. This would be Oregon, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, as well as California. Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio would remain in the Union because they had large German populations that likely wouldn't want to leave the Union over the issue of slavery, and California also would like to remain in the Union as well as Oregon because it wouldn't be very advantageous for them to leave the Union. And in our own scenario, there was a huge population of Confederate sympathizers in both states that actually wanted to support the Confederacy. So I don't really believe the idea that they would leave the Union over the issue of abolishing slavery. Same thing with Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, which also had large populations of Confederate sympathizers in the southern portions of the state, particularly Illinois. So, ultimately, I do believe that the South would win the Civil War because it had a clear military advantage with Robert E. Lee as well as several other great generals on their side, such as Stonewall Jackson, and many of the great Union generals, such as Ohio's Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, were from the state of Ohio, a which would actually be a state that would remain in the Union. It would be a border state in this alternate scenario, so thus neither of them would actually fight for the free states of America. Although Grant himself was opposed to slavery, I doubt he would join the so-called traitors in this alternate scenario by joining the free states of America's military. There would be a lot of draft riots in the South because, again, there would be a huge population of Irish immigrants that would have certain Northern sympathies due to the fact that they themselves would not want slaves to compete with in the workforce, and they would also not want slavery to expand westward. There would also be a lot of anti-war sentiment in the North, where in our own scenario there were Confederate sympathizers. There would be a lot of these Confederate sympathizers in our own scenarios would be Unionists in this alternate scenario and would want to keep the North in the Union. Ultimately, with internal divisions in the North and South, that would ultimately cancel out, to say the least, or maybe even tilt in the South's favor, because the North likely would have more divisions than the South, as well as the fact that the northern advantage of manufacturing, industrialization, and population would no longer be present in this scenario. The South would win the Civil War. And likely as a measure to ensure that to sort of put the North in its place, they would likely expand slavery to all of the Western territories, regardless of whether it was economically feasible or not. And potentially even worse, they could maybe even allow slavery in some or maybe even all of the free states and essentially declare slavery as a fundamental right by people. And this would basically be the opposite of abolition in our own scenario. But in this scenario, they would basically affirm the right of white people to own slaves in basically every state in the United States. So this would be certainly a very dark scenario for the United States. And also the United States would be very agricultural and agrarian rather than industrialized in our own scenario. And also the practice of slavery would remain widespread. And because many countries in Europe that were highly developed did not like the institution of slavery, it is very unlikely that the United States would become a world power in this scenario, also because of the fact that it is still very agrarian and agricultural and has an institution that much of the Western world that we know today would view as abhorrent. So, the United States would basically be a third world country in this alternate scenario, where instead of the South seceding from the North, it is the North that secedes from the South, all because Samuel Slater decides to abide by the law and does not immigrate to the United States. Now, thank you for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to my channel. Mr. U.S. History, out.